There's no fate but what we make for ourselves, and the fate I've made for myself is covering every Arnold movie ever, and although the future is not set, there was no stopping our arrival at this moment. It's Arnold's crowning career achievement and my personal favorite movie of all time. It's finally time for Terminator 2: Judgment Day. Hello friends, and welcome back to Every Arnold Movie Ever, episode 19. We finally reached the summit of Mount Arnold, the culmination of his entire career in one movie, Terminator 2: Judgment Day. It's a movie that almost didn't see the light of day, but just like the T-800 in the Terminator, it was able to rise from the ashes to fight another day. In 1984, James Cameron crafted a low-budget sci-fi slasher film based on a dream he had that was successful, but not quite a blockbuster. But as the years went on, thanks to Cameron directing a much bigger hit, Aliens, and Arnold Schwarzenegger's trilogy of massive successes that made him an unstoppable international star, demand for a sequel steadily grew. Because the Terminator packed rich mythology and world building into its tightly wound story, particularly the glimpses into the future and the time travel paradoxes, as a fan, you were almost dared to imagine what a sequel would look like. But throughout the 80s, a sequel was only possible in our minds because the Terminator was engaged in an unwinnable battle. The dreaded... And I admitted last time, I had it easy with Kindergarten Cop. Arnold liked the script and he was like, we make the movie. But now, we return to your regularly scheduled legal snarls. In order to make the original Terminator, James Cameron had to give up the rights to the movie, meaning he couldn't legally make a sequel unless the company that owned it asked him to. Terminator was shared by Hemdale Film Corporation and Gale Ann Hurd's Pacific Western Productions. Hurd was Cameron's former producing partner, and also ex-wife. But then again, who isn't? But back in the day, Gale bought the rights to Terminator for $1 and made a blood oath that Cameron would direct in exchange. It got the movie made, but it meant Cameron had no power over his own creation, much like Skynet becoming self-aware. One silver lining, though, was that Cameron and Arnold made a separate pact that neither of them would make a sequel without the other. No word on whether blood was involved, but there was bad blood between Cameron and Hemdale, and they refused to work with them again. We wanted to stay as far away from them as we could. Hemdale was not a company that was capable of making a classy movie that demanded a big budget. They would want to make it cheap. Similar to the rights wrangling with Dino De Laurentiis in Total Recall, see that episode by clicking up here. An above-average episode of Every Arnold Movie Ever, if you ask me, or my friend Bunker.
I'm almost done watching it. Not bad.
And he would know he's an executive producer of a TV show. Also, I don't know what he said because I recorded this before he sent that in, but I'm assuming it's extremely complimentary. So thank you so much, Bunker. Hemdale was in financial trouble because all of these production companies somehow end up in financial trouble. And Carolco Films once again came to Arnold's aid. It would cost Kassar and... Don't say it. Vanya $10 million to secure the rights to the Terminator franchise. And just before Christmas of 1989, Kassar called up James Cameron with a proposition. He asked if he'd like to direct Terminator 2, and Cameron said, I'm not really that interested. So Kassar countered by saying, we'll pay you $6 million. And Cameron was like, oh, I'm really super fucking interested. Who says money is the root of all evil? It helped get T2 made. It can't be all bad. The last request they made was that the film be ready for July 3rd, 1991. Yeah, sure. 18 months to figure out the biggest movie of all time, yeah. Luckily, Cameron thrived in these situations. He said, now we plunge into hell. One of the first people Cameron spoke to was Dennis Muren at ILM. Muren is a legend, an effects guy who worked on Star Wars, Willow, Flesh Gordon, and The Abyss. Sorry, did I say Flesh Gordon? I meant Flesh Gordon. And the reason Cameron called Muren was because he had a discarded idea left over from the Terminator, which I discussed in that episode. Now that treatment included two Terminators, the first one being the T-800 model, this one. The second one had a liquid metal exterior. The biggest issues in The Abyss were the translucent look of water. So Cameron asked if they made it metallic, could Muren morph it into a human and then a liquid version of itself throughout the movie? Muren said he'd call Cameron back, probably to watch Flesh Gordon, then called him back and said it was possible, but not in a large quantity. Cameron would have to pick his battles. Luckily, James Cameron is meticulous. particularly with storyboards.
So many of those CG shots with the T-1000, the background plates were actually shot before we shot the scene because the schedule was so rigorous for them that we couldn't wait until we shot the scene in the shooting schedule. So we had to imagine what the scene was going to look like, and then weeks or months later, we actually shot the scene that ran up to it and came after it.
He went from 14 CG shots in The Abyss to only 42 in T2. Consider that Avengers Endgame is comprised of 2,500 shots, and that is incredibly efficient. Even so, the scope was enormous. A lot of this had never been done before. Cameron was not interested in rehashing the original Terminator. He wanted to challenge expectations just like he did with Aliens. As Arnold puts it,
I never expected T2 to be just an ordinary sequel. Cameron is a big believer in surprising the audience.
When it came to the script, Cameron faced a dilemma. In the years since the Terminator, as I've covered on this channel in stupid detail, Arnold's career had exploded, and he was no longer seen as the stoic cyborg from the original movie. His last movie was Kindergarten Cop, for God's sakes. Basically, Cameron knew he couldn't go back to Arnold Schwarzenegger murdering innocent people like he did before. So, he turned that bug into a feature and inverted the conceit of the first film. Cameron says, "I would make this a story about why you can't kill people. The Tin Man gets a heart. I think of T2 as a violent movie about world peace." I love that quote. His co-writer, William Wisher, said Cameron called him, and they tried to tackle the biggest challenge of the story. How do you humanize a Terminator? Originally, they discussed a movie completely set in the future with the Future Wars, but quickly abandoned that idea because even though when I was a kid, I thought that would be an awesome idea, like, oh boy, the Future Wars, it's gotta be the Future Wars, just like when you're a kid, you're like, I can't wait for the Clone Wars. It turns out the Future Wars, it does not make for a good movie. There was a guy who existed in our universe. He's still out there somewhere, roaming around. Name's McG. He went by McG, and he made a Terminator movie, and he fucked it up. We're not going to talk about that one, even though Arnold's like CG in it for about 12 seconds. Doesn't exist. Get the fuck out of here. The next idea they had was 2 different Terminators played by Arnold, a good version and a bad version, but they realized that would be impossible for the audience to track. Also, that was only the first half of the movie. Then the second half would be Skynet trying again with the T-1000. Just too much. So they chopped off the first half and focused on the T-1000. After that, they went back to the fundamental question they were probably trying to avoid. How do you humanize a Terminator? They realized John Connor was the key. Oh, and how Cameron realized that is almost too absurd to believe. I remember sitting there once, high on E, writing notes for Terminator, and I was struck by Sting's song that I hope the Russians love their children too. And I thought, you know what? The idea of a nuclear war is just so antithetical to life itself. That's where the kid came from. James Cameron on ecstasy, chilling to a mid-80s Sting song, casually coming up with Terminator 2? Excuse me? Jesus. So, if John was the one sending the Terminator back, he could reprogram it and teach it, reflecting and examining his own values. When John tells the Terminator it can't kill, it responds like a child.
Why?
And it forces John Connor to confront the answer and have a good reason. However, when Cameron explained the idea to Arnold, he was confused.
How could the Terminator not kill anyone? He's a Terminator!
Arnold was afraid this softening was the result of studio interference, who wanted the mass appeal Arnold who co-starred with Kids and Danny DeVito. He saw the same thing happen to his beloved Conan franchise. So you can't blame Arnold for taking a second to wrap his head around this idea. He had just done Total Recall in 1990, and that was a hyper-violent, hard R, also happened to be his most successful sci-fi action movie. But Cameron assured him this was still an R-rated movie, just with a couple tweaks. Putting his trust in James Cameron, Arnold came on board, and it only cost $11 million and a personal jet. But Cameron needed one more piece before proceeding.
I would not write one word of the script until a deal had been made with Linda Hamilton.
On Aliens, production suffered because negotiations with Sigourney Weaver dragged on. Cameron did not want to repeat, so he pitched his T2 synopsis, and Hamilton had one request. I want to be crazy. Now, James agreed and dropped Sarah Connor into a mental hospital, and that's how that came about. The other thing Cameron and Hamilton agreed on was that Sarah should look physically different than the original movie. Burdened with the knowledge of the future, Sarah would hypothetically spend every waking moment preparing herself. So, through method acting, she trained with a former Israeli commando for 3 months, going off 4 hours sleep, practicing weapons handling, mission training, judo, and mental discipline. She could strip a weapon blindfolded while her trainer threw things at her. And in the scene where she picks the locks on her handcuffs with a paperclip, she actually picked the lock herself. She was intent on doing her own stunts. In fact, she did the work. She might as well do the stunts. And once Arnold and Linda were on board, Cameron and Wisher dove into the script. And they crafted an intricate, complex story with an opening time displacement sequence in Skynet's Citadel in the future, and a subplot involving a freedom fighter and former love of Sarah Connor named Gant. Did you ever hear of Gant before? And neither did I. Until now. Carolco was flying the T2 crew to Cannes to sell the movie, and Cameron wanted to have a draft for the flight over. But it wasn't finished. So he worked while the limo waited outside to take him to the plane. He printed the thing out, rushed onto the plane, and it was full of all these Hollywood filmmakers, big-time names, Paul Verhoeven, Oliver Stone, and they all booed him as he walked down the aisle. But he was able to hand that script to Arnold, and when Arnold read it, he said,
Several times I read something that I had no fucking idea what he was talking about. I said, what is a polyalloy? By the time we landed, we'd read it and were jumping all over the airplane in excitement about how big and technologically sophisticated the story was. This script blew me away.
Arnold couldn't just repeat his performance from the original Terminator. This was basically a brand new character. This time around, he would have to learn how to learn as a machine and grow throughout the movie.
We were shooting the scenes out of sequence, so we were always having to figure out the right degree of humanity for the Terminator to show for that stage in the plot. For the first several weeks, I was constantly asking Jim, is he too human now or not human enough?
However, Arnold still had trouble wrapping his head around a Terminator who doesn't kill. Eventually, Cameron was able to convince Arnold of the positives, and Arnold said,
It was strange, but I thought, if we pull it off, it will be huge.
Reflective of a lot of his career choices, this was another big risk Arnold was willing to take. Casting was a lot easier this time around. No O.J. Simpson, and they had the 2 principal actors returning, but they still needed to find a kid, always a difficult task, and the T-1000 to play off Arnold. For the T-1000, Cameron was looking for someone physical, but not big, a stark contrast to Arnold.
If the 800 series is a kind of human Panzer tank, then the 1000 series had to be a Porsche.
He briefly considered Billy Idol in the role, but that went away when Billy Idol got into a motorcycle crash. When Robert Patrick came in to read, he was a relative unknown. He brought this stealth athleticism to the role. He kind of moved like a cat, and there was like one moment where they moved the camera behind him and he kind of turned his head in a way that surprised everybody, and he feels like that's the moment that got him the role. And he needed to be Arnold's opposite, sleek and fast, and that would make it all the more surprising when the T-800 became an underdog stacked up against him, a crucial component to any successful Arnold movie. For the role of John Connor, Cameron was insistent that he wasn't a live-action Bart Simpson, but a 3-dimensional character who represents a troubled upbringing. He hired casting director Molly Finn, who was responsible for The Untouchables, Flatliners, and in the future, Titanic and The Matrix. Molly met with thousands of child actors, but was coming up empty. Eventually, she decided to visit the Boys and Girls Club of Pasadena and came across a 13-year-old named Edward Furlong, who lived with his uncle instead of his mother and didn't even know his father. Furlong didn't even want to go to the club that day, but his uncle made him. Fate. As Furlong recalls, I mean, who knows in this frickin' town what's going on when this older lady is staring at you and comes up to you? His first words to her were, "What do you want, frog lips?" And there was a rawness to him that broke through the shiny, rehearsed kid actors that they had been auditioning. As Cameron puts it, there was a pain, there was surliness, there was an intelligence. What you see in the movie was all there. It was just a question of pulling it out. The credit totally goes to Malley. Cameron says it was the single scariest decision of the film. The whole film, all the money and all the work and all the energy that was spent could go right in the toilet if the kid didn't work. Shooting went on so long that Eddie Furlong's voice broke halfway through shooting, which is obvious and a famously distinct part of his character.
Put the gun down now! Ow!
But also super realistic and relatable. My voice was cracking at the exact same time, made me feel a little bit better about myself. When they did the reshoots, his growth spurt forced them to dig a hole for him to stand in so his height could match the original scenes. That's a pretty lo-fi effect, but when it came to the effects in T2, James Cameron's philosophy of action sequences led the charge. I make a conscious stylistic decision to create mayhem, but mayhem can't come from mayhem. It has to come from extreme organization. That organization means T2's effects are a blend of practical effects, rear projection, miniatures, stunt casting of twins, fake mirrors, and of course, computer graphics, something they didn't really have in '84. Most people only talk about the morph effects of the T-1000, but there are so many ingenious techniques applied in this movie. Yes, the CG is great, but the most indelible images of the T-1000 are all practical Stan Winston creations. Look at this shit! Pretzel Man, Splash Head, Donut Head, Cleave Man. We stand Stan. And speaking of legends, watching some of the behind-the-scenes footage of this, I also learned that Robert Patrick was a big Nine Inch Nails fan. That was before Downward Spiral, like Pretty Hate Machine era. But the CG was obviously the biggest risk. Computer graphics and film were still experimental at this stage. The Total Recall X-ray scene and the Abyss water scene were the closest we'd gotten to digital effects on screen. So they had to revolutionize CG for film, which inadvertently led to the creation of programs we still use on a daily basis today. For instance, when the T-1000 was stretched in any direction in the computer, it would create these gaps at its shoulders, and they couldn't figure out why. They brought in scientists and mathematicians to solve the problem, but in the end, John Knoll of ILM came up with the solution. Knoll worked on Willow and the Abyss. He also had the idea for what would become Rogue One, and he invented software for the Mac called Display. And that software would later become the first version of Photoshop that was able to handle T-1000's movements. Brad Fiedel returned to do the score for T2, and it's less synthy than the original, more metallic and cinematic. It's one of my all-time favorite scores, and I own the cassette tape like a little weirdo. I'd have it in my Walkman. I'd be walking around like, yeah, ooh. Hey, what are you listening to? Nirvana? Def Leppard? No, is this the Terminator 2 score? Oh, like Guns N' Roses? No, it's just the soundtrack. Okay. Filming began on October 8th, 1990, on one of the most expensive movies of all time at that time, $88 million. As production began, Wisher and Cameron trimmed the script to remove the opening sequence in Skynet, as well as fucking Gant. Poor Gant. Gotta go. T2 opens in apocalyptic 2029 with a lengthy VO from Sarah Connor, basically giving us a previously on the Terminator. Then teasing that 2 Terminators have been sent back this time, one to protect and one to destroy. It's an interesting choice to tell then show, but it gives the following scenes added tension because we already understand the goal of both Terminators. A little bit of a shortcut. The future sequences here have a lot more detail than the original movie. Not as much bee smoke in that background. My god, those sets must have been riddled with bees! And right from the start, T2 is about recontextualizing moments from the original and creating new moments out of them. They aren't mere nostalgia pops, though. The new context informs the changes in the old characters and establishes how new characters react to familiar moments. Here, the future wars aren't to establish Kyle Reese, they're to introduce us to John Connor, leader of the Resistance, with facial scars intended to be an homage to Tom Berenger in Platoon, which seems like a weird homage for the savior of your Resistance, but okay. Then we get a series of scenes that are dominoes being set up. We're back in the present where we meet Arnold's T-800. He enters the Corral Bar to the shock of patrons and employees. And I always love this lady's performance where she goes from shocked to immediately pleased. When Arnold shot this scene, he was wearing these crazy loud 90s swim trunks. I kind of wish he went through the whole movie wearing those. But he finds a match for clothes. And much like in The Terminator, he's laughed off and met with resistance. There are so many fun details in this sequence. The guy gets thrown through the pass-through, but then he also falls on the stove, and then this guy thinks twice about attacking. These types of moments are littered throughout the movie and do so much to build out a lived-in world with personality. Then we get the most absurd music cue in the movie. It is so on the nose, and I want to hate it, but I'm powerless to resist. Ugh. The next domino is the T-1000, in a direct contrast to Arnold's entrance, efficient and deadly. We aren't tipped off to the T-1000's abilities yet, just seems like he steals the cops' clothes. By the way, the choice to make Robert Patrick a police officer had dual purpose. William Wisher said if he's a police officer, he can go places and do things and won't be questioned. Cameron said, that was just me having fun with an authority figure. But the thematic point to that is that we, as human beings, become Terminators. We learn how to have zero compassion. Cameron knows what's up. Now, next up is John Connor, who's currently hanging out with Danny Cooksey, who played Bobby Budnick from Salute Your Shorts, a Nickelodeon show that debuted on July 4th, 1991, same day as Terminator 2. Everything's coming up Cooksey. John's foster mom, Janelle, asks him to clean up his room.
John!
And Budnick completely overreacts.
Your foster parents are kind of dicks, huh?
I don't know. I might argue that John's being the dick in that situation. Now, they scoot away to the sounds of Guns N' Roses, and it's clear they added this song in post because the only part Budnick knows is... Come on, that could fit into any song from 1991. Then we're off to Pescadero Hospital to see what Sarah's been up to. Dr. Silberman returns from the original as the smug psychiatrist who's made her something of a pet project. He explains the plot of the Terminator to the fellow doctors who didn't have time to see it or hear Sarah's recap at the beginning of the movie.
But the father of her child was a soldier sent back to protect her.
And we immediately find out that Sarah is feisty. She stabbed Silberman in the knee with his pen, and she turns around with purpose twice. The T-1000, meanwhile, visits Todd and Janelle in a recontextualized scene from the Terminator tracking down its target at their home. Great visual gag here to protect and serve. And Robert Patrick is just so good in this scene because he is trying his best to be human, but there's something off and he's unable to hide the robotic malice when he finds out about the
Big guy on a bike. Has that got something to do with this?
John steals some money from an ATM, and this is an excellent example of an action-informing character, but also setting up a plot device that gets paid off later. John learns some shady survival tactics from his mom, and naturally, since he isn't preparing for the apocalypse, he does what any punk kid would do and uses it to steal some money and go play video games.
Easy money. Come on.
Sarah's trying to get moved to minimum security so she can go see John.
You have to let me see my son.
They watch a video of her explaining her recurring nuclear holocaust dream.
They fly apart like leaves.
Although Sarah's long cigarette ash always makes me nervous. Ash that cig, Sarah! Silberman sees through her ploy and seems to relish denying her, and Sarah reacts appropriately. The last domino to set up before things really kick into gear is to introduce Miles Dyson, an employee at Cyberdyne who uses the technology from the original Terminator's arm and chip to create the program that'll eventually lead to said nuclear holocaust. And in a parallel to Kyle Reese going back in time to impregnate Sarah, we get another time paradox loop. How can they create technology from the very same technology they're creating? It doesn't make any sense.
You know, I asked them that very same question once, and you know what they told me? Don't ask.
Fair enough. And now our dominoes are in place, and the two Terminators close in on their target. And before the shit hits the fan, I just want to point out the absurd amount of hilarious incidental vehicular mayhem that occurs throughout this movie thanks to these two Terminators. Cars are constantly crashing in the background, and it makes me laugh every single time. Now the Terminators track John to Arnold's favorite place, the mall, and it leads to a confrontation in the back hallway. Now, up until this point, if you didn't see any of the marketing materials or trailers, there's still some tension as to which Terminator is good and which is bad. Here we find out the T-800 is here to protect John.
Get down!
And let's take a moment to appreciate these gunshot wounds on the T-1000, which are completely practical, not CGI. They're latex foam appliances that blossom when triggered by a remote. And it's here that we find out the T-1000 is not just a capable adversary to the T-800, it's superior. It's something else to see Arnold struggle to overpower the T-1000, who weighs 165 pounds, yet it feels completely believable. We get a visual gag of the T-1000 looking at this metallic mannequin, and it's funny, but it also assumes you've either seen the movie before or you know how the T-1000 works the first time around. When I saw it on opening night way back in 1991, everyone laughed, which shows the public's awareness level of T2 from the start. This leads to our first big chase of the movie, and Robert Patrick's run is unholy. Take that, Tom Cruise. He says he designed it so it was mostly lower body motion, and then his arms could be held out in front in case he needed to turn them into knives and stabbing weapons. He commandeers this truck, and the chase spills appropriately into the LA spillway. The fact that these stunts were performed practically gives everything a weight, and it's tactile and visceral. It all feels real and dangerous. It's the same reason why Mad Max Fury Road became an instant classic. Yes, it was enhanced by some CG, but you know they went out in the desert and they performed 99% of those stunts. Arnold does his unfathomably cool shotgun reload that took a lot of work.
It all sounded great in the script, and it was doable, just a matter of reps, but the preparation was pure pain and discomfort. I couldn't wear a glove because it would get stuck in the gun mechanism, and I tore the skin off my hand and fingers practicing 100 times until I mastered the skill. Then I had to learn to do it while riding to Harley. Then I needed to put the writing and the gun skill together with the acting. It's hard to watch where you're driving and look where the director wants you to look at the same time.
Also, he booped Eddie Furlong on the head more than once. Boop. And another amazing stunt. Is this one of the best chase scenes of all time? It's certainly up there. I love that you can clearly see the dummy. And, okay, the sparking sound effect is my version of ASMR. I could listen to that for hours. It's right up there with Jango Fett's seismic charge. And we finally get our full view of the liquid metal CG, done through a combination of drawing a grid on Robert Patrick, creating a skeleton off of that, animating his gait based on that original footage, then repeating the shot numerous times, and having Robert Patrick match the movements. And for this being a 30-year-old effect, it holds up, particularly the morph from liquid metal to real actor. John calls a timeout, and the T-800 goes into exposition mode, something he didn't have to deal with in the original.
My mission is to protect you.
Who sent you?
You did.
John wants to check in with his foster parents, but the T-800 already knows what's up.
The T-1000 would definitely try to reacquire you there. I would.
And we get another remixed Terminator scene in a different context. Instead of Sarah talking to the Terminator impersonating her mom, it's John talking to the T-1000 impersonating his foster mom. But the T-800 is one step ahead.
What's the dog's name?
Max, what's wrong with Wolfie? Wolfie's fine, honey.
First, the parents are dead.
Here's another killer practical effect.
Tell the kid to get rid of that fucking mutt.
Here we go, and action!
And another complicated morph sequence. Then we reach a pivotal scene with about 12 important pieces of information revealed. John feels guilty because his mom was telling the truth, and Eddie Furlong gives a really strong performance here, especially for someone who's never acted before.
But everything she said was true, and nobody believed her. Not even me.
Then he finds out the T-1000 will most likely kill Sarah to get to him.
Shit, why did you tell me? We gotta go right now!
Then he learns that the Terminator has to do what he says.
Let me go!
But he also learns the consequences of owning a Terminator when these poor guys come over to help because, you know, John was yelling for help.
Help!
This does not help our mission.
Help!
And the speed with which John's attitude switches over to cocky asshole is astounding.
You okay, kid?
Take a hike, bozo.
These guys are rewarded for their kindness, with John calling them bozos and jock douchebags. Then they get a broken hand and a near murder. But all of this eventually reveals John's true moral compass and his first step to becoming a leader.
You just can't go around killing people.
He orders the Terminator not to kill, which creates a ripple effect throughout the rest of the movie. But since this is a Terminator, it chooses the most violent way to not kill people.
He'll live.
Great joke. Back at Pescadero, the lead singer of Bare Naked Ladies licks Sarah's cheek, and if I had $1 million, I'd bet he's gonna pay for that. But first, this security guard steps on the T-1000 on his way to get some coffee, and this is another scene full of small character touches. This guy could have just gotten his coffee and gotten killed, but he asks the orderly if she wants any. She gets her character moment.
How about a beer?
And then he gets a little funny character moment too.
Hey, I got a full house.
Must be my lucky day.
It's not necessary to the plot per se, but it injects humanity and shows the difference between the humans and the machines. Anyway, turns out to not be this guy's lucky day. And this doubling effect was pulled off not by doing a split screen, but by hiring twins. Nice horror villain head tilt there. Now, it's been 5 minutes since we've checked in with Bare Naked Licky, and he gets pummeled. This attack is vicious, and it's a simple combo of a sound effect and a simple flash frame to white. Gets me every time. It's been one lick since you knocked me out. Sarah's free, and I adore the little hop she does anytime she starts running. But there is nothing adorable about what she does to Dr. Silberman. This shit is diabolical, and as someone who does not like needles, this has stuck with me, no pun intended, my whole life. 4 great touches in this sequence are the security guard with the cast, the way this poor bastard flails around on the ground, and this nerdy guy being a hero. You know this guy went home that night and told all his friends this story, and definitely left out the part where he gets absolutely bodied. Also, I like when Sarah breaks off the key in the lock. Really smart. Then we get the reunion we've been waiting for. Sarah and the T-800. The look of fear in her face, the screeching of her feet on the linoleum. It's terrifying, and all her preparation has led to this moment, and it still leaves her unprepared. It's a great way to remind the audience that the Terminator is still something to be feared, and not just John's pet. Sarah sees John, and the T-800 gives another recontextualized line.
Come with me if you want to live.
The T-1000 shows up, and here's another one of those meticulously planned CG shots with another memorable little touch. Silberman drops the needle cap in shock, shades of Ray and Ghostbusters. Tons of great effects here. Old sauce head, a practical effect followed by CG. I should also mention the plethora of people who get thrown into walls. It is oddly satisfying, and if I could combine that with the spark sound effect, I think that's porn. Sarah, John, and the T-800 escape, and Sarah hugs John. It's a really nice moment of a mother and her son. JK, she's just checking to make sure he isn't hurt.
I said it was okay.
Not exactly what John was looking for there.
I had to get you out of that place.
And the Terminator just embarrasses him even further.
What's wrong with your eyes?
What the fuck, dude? But that's also a setup for a later payoff. The Connor crew takes refuge in a gas station, and in this scene we learn that the T-800 can learn.
The more contact I have with humans, the more I learn.
We're given a metaphor of the vigilant protector on constant watch, and John teaches the Terminator that there are other ways to get what you want.
Are we learning yet?
And how to talk like a normal, well, I don't know, I guess 10-year-old.
You don't say affirmative. You say no problemo. You say eat me. Hasta la vista, baby. Chill out. Or later, dickwad.
Chill out, dickwad.
Another one of those character development / setups that will pay off later, and things take a depressing turn here, where the Terminator gives us a stark assessment of the human race.
We're not gonna make it, are we?
It's in your nature to destroy yourselves.
Sarah learns about Miles Dyson, and Arnold again has to deliver a huge info dump of exposition.
The director of special projects. In a few months, he creates a revolutionary type of micro. 3 years, Cyberdyne will become the largest. All stealth bombers are upgraded with Cyberdyne. The Skynet funding bill is passed. The system, human decisions are removed from.
But it's all important to understanding Sarah's motivation when she goes after Dyson. But first, we got to take a detour to Sarah's buddy Enrique in Mexico. Enrique meets the Terminator and absolutely nails the reaction.
¿Quién es el grandote este?
Uncle Bob.
Uncle Bob, huh? Okay.
Okay. I still say that all the time. Then we get more family bonding with John and Bob.
That's definitely you.
And this moment walks a fine line between sincerity and syrupy.
Why do you cry?
John does a pretty shitty job of explaining the basic act of crying.
We just cry when it hurts. It's when there's nothing wrong with you, but you're hurt anyways. You get it?
No.
But that's okay. The Terminator isn't supposed to understand it yet. And Sarah can see that the Terminator is the best father figure John could ask for. But she knows it can't last. She's haunted by the nightmares of the future and what the machines will ultimately do. This nuclear attack is a shocking scene in a major blockbuster. Even today, the effects were created through miniatures and high-powered fans, and Sarah's driven by the words told to her by Kyle Reese. There's no fate but what we make for ourselves. So Sarah sets off to kill Miles Dyson, but here's the thing. In doing so, she becomes the thing she fears most. A Terminator. The Terminators were sent back to kill her and John before they lead the resistance to stop the machines. Sarah wants to kill Dyson before he's responsible for the end of the world. Same methods, different motivations. Here's another great touch with Miles' son inadvertently saving his life with a little technology of his own. And in the end, Sarah retains a shred of humanity and doesn't pull the trigger. John and the T-800 show up, and we get another echo from the original.
I love you, John. I always have.
I love you. I always have.
They need to prove to Miles that his work has to stop, so the Terminator cuts open his arm, and this effect is just seamless. Arnold basically had a second fake arm attached to his real arm, and that's enough to convince Dyson.
I feel like I'm gonna throw up.
He realizes he's got to destroy everything, so it's off to Cyberdyne. And their plan is flawed.
Friends from out of town. I just thought I'd take them upstairs and show them around.
And they immediately improvise. I love how mad this guy gets at poor Carl for leaving his post.
Gibbons, come on, man!
And then immediately switches gears when he realizes things are all fucked up.
Oh, shit.
Dyson's car gets locked out of the system, but luckily John can get through thanks to his card reader trick from earlier.
Easy money.
And finally, the T-1000 re-enters the story. The Terminator says it will take care of the police, and we get a classic line delivery.
Hey, wait, you swore!
Trust me.
A line we first heard in Commando.
Trust me.
Then we get our iconic minigun scene.
That's a damn minigun!
0 casualties, and another little character moment where Miles is still precious about the Terminator hand, and John is like, yeah, fuck that. But what's funny is, the Terminator's minigun moment is awesome, but only buys him like 3 extra minutes tops, because here come the cops, and there goes Miles. He does go out in style, though.
I don't know how much longer I can hold this.
And oh, hey, it's Dean Norris showing up in his second Arnold movie, the first being Total Recall. He might give Sven-Ole Thorsen a run for his money when this is all said and done. Then we get this spectacular, very real explosion. The building was an empty warehouse scheduled for demolition, but Cameron got his hands on it first. It took over 100 gallons of gasoline to create this spectacular moment. Coming out of the elevator, the Connor crew is trapped, and then we get the repeat of Arnold's most famous line.
Stay here, I'll be back.
Though it might be the flattest delivery of I'll be back in his career.
I'll be back.
It's visually interesting until he gets completely engulfed in smoke when he says the line. I never really paid attention to that before, but like, he is pretty much not even on screen when he says his iconic line. He confronts the SWAT crew and does his knee shooting thing. This guy hates knees. Another setup gets paid off, and they're out of there. But the T-1000 is in pursuit, and for some reason rides his bike up the stairs to the top floor of the building. Why? Well, probably just so he can get this kick-ass moment. And then another callback to the original.
Get out.
Now we head into the last act and the final chase, which has mirrors to the original's climax, except this one is about 300 times bigger. The T-1000 chases them with a helicopter, where they do this insane stunt by flying the chopper underneath the bridge. And I remember it being a big deal when my friend noticed the T-1000 had 3 hands in this scene, as if that was some sort of continuity error. The weird thing is that we never see him grow any extra limbs in the movie, and then they never establish it here. They just got a third arm suddenly. Regardless, third arm doesn't help because the helicopter crashes, the police van crashes, and now it's time to find another mode of transportation. Here's another one of those little character moments. The guy whose truck they take runs full speed and flips himself off the bridge to escape the tanker. Then another little setup where the T-800 loses his grenade round. The second leg of the chase is highlighted by the T-800 climbing aboard the liquid nitrogen tanker and just plugging away at the T-1000 at point blank range, then rolling the tanker, and the T-1000 gets frozen, and we get easily the most iconic line of the movie, surpassing I'll Be Back, at least in the context of this movie.
Hasta la vista, baby.
It's not as darkly funny as I'll Be Back in the original Terminator, but it's still a great character moment. That moment doesn't last long, though, as the T-1000 starts to reform. And where is a broom when you need one? They could have just swept that shit into the molten steel and gone on vacation. Instead, the T-800 goes back for its last grenade round. There's some pretty obvious blue and red good versus evil lighting in this sequence. It's very Star Wars. Terminator tries to buy some time, but gets his ass handed to him. This fight is a fantastic contrast of the T-800's smash and grab brutality and the T-1000's slick, slippery style. Arnold gets essentially murdered here, and it's pretty crazy to see, especially at this point in his career. We haven't seen him die on screen since the fake-out death in The Running Man, though he came disgustingly close in Total Recall. Little ears. Meanwhile, Sarah and John reunite, but at the last second, another Sarah shows up, and he realizes one of them is the T-1000.
Get out of the way, John! Shoot!
Sarah gets close to taking it out, but can't quite do it, and receives a Dikembe Mutombo taunt for her troubles. Luckily, the T-800 makes its comeback, fires his last grenade, and if you haven't gotten the point of this video yet, Stan Winston is a god. Then the T-1000 eats itself to death, and the world is saved.
I need a vacation.
That's the one line that falls flat for me. It really is the only time we have a line that doesn't have a setup. We never see him learn about vacation, and it's not in any of the deleted scenes. It's a very Arnold line, but it rings false in this context. It's a lot like... But he's in luck because a permanent vacation is just around the corner.
There's one more chip.
But it can't self-terminate. So it's up to Sarah to take out the only father figure John ever had.
No, it'll be okay. Stay with us. It'll be okay.
And yes, of course, this scene makes me emotional. It's super sad. The poor kid's losing his best bud.
I order you not to go. I order you not to go.
I know now why you cry, but it's something I can never do.
But we end with some optimism as Sarah says she faces the future with a sense of hope. If a machine can learn the value of human life, maybe we can too. Wait until you get to 2022, Sarah. You might change your mind. Arnold is at his absolute best here. A perfect blend of his stoic stillness and deadpan comic timing.
He'll live.
While infusing a machine with just enough humanity to make you care or even cry when his time comes to an end. Some of that is the way John projects his feelings onto it. You understand that John sees the Terminator as a father figure who's more interested in John and asks him way more questions than even his own mother. Playing a Terminator is deceptively difficult, particularly one that evolves as the film goes on. Since they were shooting it out of sequence, Arnold had to be aware of how much humanity his character possessed in each scene. He has way more lines in this movie than the original, 58 words versus 700 this time around, and some of that is the complicated exposition.
And mimetic polyalloy.
But it's the moments that toe the line between cheesy and emotional that hit just right and take this movie over the top.
I know now why you cry.
Now, Arnold plays a Terminator again several times in his career, and the quality will vary. One leans a little too comedic, the other's too bland. Another one, I would say, outright excellent, but the balance is never as good as it is here. And that's a testament to Arnold and James Cameron's dedication to the character and making sure the smallest details are accounted for. Arnold kills it in this role. Before James Cameron even had a script, there was a teaser trailer for T2. It featured zero footage from the movie, just this incredible sequence of the Terminator being created in a factory. Man, I watched this on repeat on my Total Recall VHS tape all the time. It's one of the all-time great teasers, even though I always felt like the machine hand never quite lined up with the mold. It cost $500,000, and Cameron didn't even shoot it. For that, he turned to, once again, our hero, Stan Winston. But that teaser was all people needed to lose their minds. And it was a shorthand that told the audience the T-800 came from an assembly line, making it possible story-wise for Arnold to return to the franchise. By the time the movie was finished, Carol Coe was a little worried that a Terminator who doesn't kill would come across as emasculated in the trailers, so they created a 3-tiered marketing strategy to get the audience used to this new version of the Terminator. Stage 1, just focus on Arnold returning. Stage 2, reveal the T-1000 as an even deadlier villain. And Stage 3, don't worry, Arnold is the hero who will save the day.
This time, he's back for good.
Ugh, you know the executive who came up with that was so smug about it too. What if this time he's back for good? T2 opened on Salute Your Shorts Day, July 4th, 1991, as promised, and over that weekend, was responsible for more than half of all movie tickets sold in North America. Its opening gross was $52 million, and it ultimately went on to make over $500 million worldwide. That's 4 times the return of the original Terminator. It's the biggest movie of Arnold's career, but not Cameron's. He somehow climbed higher, and then even higher, and who knows where he'll go next. Hey, never count James Cameron out, friends. Reviews were overwhelmingly positive, the best reviews of Arnold's career. The legendary critic Pauline Kael wrote, "Arnold was lucky in playing the Terminator early, and he was smart to play it again. He's ideal for playing not quite human figures. They end up seeming more human than the humans he plays." I remember staying up to watch Siskel and Ebert's review. I was so excited to catch a glimpse of a clip, because back in the day, that's what you had to do, and also to hear what they had to say about it, and they did not disappoint.
This is one terrific action picture. I enjoyed it a lot more than the original. And
really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the way Schwarzenegger is somehow, he has this uncanny ability to find just the right note, somewhere between seriousness and humor.
So it was critically acclaimed. General audiences made it the biggest movie of 1991, and it was even honored at the Oscars. Stan Winston and Jeff Dahn won a statue for Best Makeup, and Murin won Best Visual Effects. Hey, it also won for Best Sound Editing and Best Sound. Everyone loves T2. I love T2 because it's so much more than a sci-fi action movie. It's got big ideas couched in a summer blockbuster package, a story as meticulously crafted as the inside of a watch, a resonant emotional core about mothers and sons, surrogate fathers, whether we have any reasonable control over the fate of our own lives, and something that hits me harder now that I have kids, passing our personal burdens, along with the burdens of our entire world, onto our children. Of course, in real life, we don't need artificial intelligence to kill us. We're doing a fine job of that on our own. T2 also happens to be an incredible action film with revolutionary special effects, the first truly successful melding of practical and computer-generated images. The T-1000 design is an improvement over the effects of The Abyss, and its technology paved the way for CG for decades to come, most notably by Dennis Murin in Jurassic Park, a movie that, by the way, was partially responsible for the downfall of Arnold's next movie, Last Action Hero. Everything in T2 is done with a purpose. It's propulsive. Every line of dialogue is important, and if it's not, it at least informs character. Every action set piece is logical and furthers the story. There is no fat. Cameron's instinct is spot on, and it's evident when you see what he left on the cutting room floor. Scenes that over-explain certain story elements that Cameron could get to a lot faster with a line of dialogue without losing the importance of the story. And since I was already an Arnold fan and grew up on his movies, this was the ultimate reward for my fandom. A near perfect creation that combined all the skills Arnold had been honing for the last 20 years. This movie continues to stand the test of time. And when I was a kid, I was about the same age as Eddie Furlong, and watching him in T2 was like watching myself. He was my surrogate. I even tried to grow my hair out like his, but instead of growing down and having the cool, like, floppy movement, it grew out like a mushroom. I am not going to show you a picture because that would be incredibly embarrassing. I hope you're happy. I hope you're happy. Speaking of hope, this is a story about hope, much like the original. Although there are moments of nihilism, the vision of nuclear war, the declaration that it's in our nature to destroy ourselves, John Connor, a young boy, does everything he can to preserve the future without perverting it. He tells the Terminator not to kill. He rushes to stop Sarah from killing Dyson, even though it could prevent the future, and helps her regain her humanity in the process. The underlying theme here is that we have the power to change the future, which is in direct opposition to the theme of Terminator 3, which basically says no matter what you do, you're stuck on an inevitable concrete path. That's the big twist of that movie, and while it adds an interesting wrinkle to an otherwise surface-level action film, it's also just a bummer of an ending. Originally, Cameron shot an ending with Linda Hamilton as an old woman, talking about how everything was saved and they lived happily ever after, but the audience reaction was universally negative, and Carolco convinced Cameron to change the ending. He had to hastily grab some extra footage from the drive to Cyberdyne, and then he directed Linda Hamilton's VO over the phone days before the movie was released. But thank God he did, because it's a much better ending, and I think Cameron was trying to close the loop with that original ending and like more securely prevent more Terminator movies from being made. Maybe if that happened, we wouldn't have been subjected to something like Terminator Genesis. But I also think, just like T3, we were always destined to get endless sequels for the Terminator, no matter how Cameron ended T2. T2 was a big movie for merchandise. They had giant Subway cups. It also had a robust toy collection. Since there aren't a ton of toyetic characters other than the Terminators, it was one of those collections where they just added a bunch of gimmicks to the figures so they could sell like 15 versions of the T-800. And they had this bioflesh regenerator thing where you could put flesh on your Terminator skeletons and run around with naked action figures if that was your thing. I don't know, at least they gave him a little bandolier. There was a shitty Nintendo game continuing the tradition of shitty Arnold games, but also an awesome arcade game, Light Gun Shooter, which 1UP has also released as a home arcade. One day, it could be mine. Speaking of could be mine, let's not forget the Guns N' Roses tie-in song, You Could Be Mine. The video, directed by Stan Winston, features a mini-story where the Terminator attends a GNR concert in search of the band, and then at the end deems them a waste of ammo. Pretty funny, actually. I've definitely seen T2 more than any movie in my life. I literally wore out my VHS tape in the VCR, shredding it to ribbons right at the part where Arnold picks up the baby. We had to open it up, tape it back together, even transfer it to another VHS shell. Try that with a streaming movie nowadays. Luckily, I also got this Holy Grail version of T2 for Christmas one year. Santa had to buy it from Suncoast Video, and back then, these types of things were not cheap. It's the special edition with the deleted scenes restored, which, you can find on YouTube easily. But back in the day, this was a cherished item. Yeah, I was obsessed with T2. I still am to some extent. I saw it 4 times in the theater when it came out, even though I was only 12. The first time we saw it, the theater was so packed that we had to sit in the front row. And it's the reason why I now get to the theater obnoxiously early, or better yet, only go to movies with assigned seating. And when they re-released it in 2017 with a remastered 3D version, I took several of my coworkers at the time to see it, and some of them were seeing it for the first time, including my friend Robert Evans, and here's what Robert says of that experience.
I was born in 1983, and I love post-apocalyptic fiction, but I didn't see Terminator 2 for the first time until 2017, which is odd until you realize that 2017 is also the first year I ever ate a salad, and that's true. But part of the reason I didn't bother seeing Terminator 2 for so long is because, like a lot of iconic films, it feels like if you don't see it in theaters right when it comes out, what's the point? So much of it gets spoiled for you. It's like, why bother seeing Raiders of the Lost Ark if you've already seen the opening credits of Muppet Babies? As with Terminator 2, it was like, I already had all the action figures. They're not toys, Mom! They're adult collectibles! I knew the big catchphrase, you know what I'm talking about, we all know it. But obviously, in 2017, I finally pulled the trigger. I saw Terminator 2 anyway, and as it turned out, it hadn't been spoiled for me at all. The film is so much more than its iconic scenes and its catchphrases. I'd say it's as good as any film today, but honestly, it's probably better. For some reason, CGI is getting worse, and I don't know, I can't understand that. Anyway, that's my feedback, and if you enjoyed it, let Steve know. And maybe, like the Terminator, I'll come back.
Thank you, Robert. Everyone go watch Impact Wrestling, and let's get to the stats. Acting chops, 10 out of 10. Peak Arnold doesn't get any better than this. Kill count, 1-ish for the Terminator. Can you kill something that's not technically alive? For a total of 344 and a half. Catchphrase, hasta la vista, baby. And here are the every Arnold movie ever rankings. Number 17, Terminator 2. I changed my mind. This movie sucks. Kidding. Obviously, that's number 1. Total Recall's reign is glorious, but short-lived. Next, Arnold follows up the greatest hit of his career with the greatest, most public flop of his career, a movie that marked the beginning of the end of his box office reign, the fascinating failure, Last Action Hero. I bought this magazine, this T2 magazine, and read it cover to cover pretty much constantly. I've hung on to this thing for like 30 years. And look, hey, there's a 900 number. We should call it. Should we call it?
The call you are attempting to place is not allowed from this line. Dial 1-800-331-0500 from a landline phone. Desde esta línea, no se
Landline?
permite-